powerful speaker, please join me in welcoming back Professor David Clayton.
Thank you very much indeed. Nice to be back again. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the opening prayer, Father. I'm going to talk today about traditions in sacred art, focusing mainly on the figurative traditions. So I talked about what you might call the patterns, the patterned art of the sacred tradition, and how it permeates all that we do in ways that we don't often expect it, or it can do potentially. I talked about this on Friday. Let's just go back to this emphasis on beauty again. It's very difficult to define what art is. I think I would say, use a very broad definition, just say art is anything that is done by man, anything that is made by man as an artisan, and the works of art that we're talking about here are paintings and sculpture predominantly. So that's what when I use the word, that's what I'm thinking of. So good art is beautiful and it communicates truth. And that really is always the case. If there's anything that we think is ugly, we should reject it. We might argue about what is beautiful or what is ugly. We might have differences of opinion, but we should never willingly accept something that we don't think is beautiful. And it communicates truth. Now, it's that last part that I want to focus on today. We talked about beauty a little bit yesterday. I know you've had these lectures on the transcendentals. We're going to talk about how a painting can be consistent with what is true. Does the content conform to truth? So the question is, does what is it is actually showing represent something that is true? Now, does the form reveal truth? Because it's possible to have something that where the content seems just right, but the style, by form, I mean not just what is painted, if you like, but how it is painted. That can be consistent with what the artist is trying to communicate, or it can work against it. That will be a surprise to many people. Many people will feel, perhaps not in this audience, but generally would think that this is just a personal choice of the artist. It's up to them to express the way they feel personally that it ought to be done. Not so, I would suggest, and we're going to talk about that. Then you ask yourself, is it beautiful? And only then do I like it. Remember that we said that I like it does not equal it is good. It's not that we remove the element of personal taste from the equation at all, but even to ask those questions when we're looking at a work of art is at least introducing some principles of discernment. We might argue at each stage as to how we answer these, and there may be differences of opinion, but it's a major advancement, I would say, to say that beauty is one of the criterions that we're interested in. And even if I think it's true in some way, and in content and form, but it's not beautiful, what it indicates is somewhere along the line, one of my judgments is wrong. There's a conflict here somewhere, so I need to be suspicious. Okay, so here is a painting that was done in 1910. Now, this, I think, as far as I know, I don't look at it in too much detail. The content here is true. Here we have Christ on the cross. I'm sure we could analyse it. It may be contrary to the gospel, but I'm assuming that everything in terms of the content is fine. But this is just the sort of painting that, in a way, started me off on the course that I've been on for the last 15 years or so. Because after I converted, I was converted, as with many people, a number of things led to my conversion. But one was the beauty of the liturgy in the Brompton Oratory, a church in London. And seeing in this church, which doesn't have art that people are flocking to see, but nevertheless it has art which is in unity with the liturgy, and experiencing this Mass where I could tell that all the art and the music and the liturgy, even the smells and the postures of the people, everything was in unity, in harmony, towards an end. So just to give a little example, I heard the choir singing polyphony. I don't think I'd ever heard live polyphony before, and it was like I could hear the different voices, but it was as though it was a single voice. They were in a gallery somewhere towards the front of the church on the right, but I couldn't see where they were, and the singing just seemed to fill the atmosphere of the church. And I remember thinking, this could be what angels sound like. And that thought actually just crossed my mind. And this is before I was a Catholic. I didn't even know this was a Catholic church. And I started to look around for the choir, and I looked up to see, thought maybe there's something up there. And I saw these angels flying across the ceiling of the church. And it struck me at that point that everything here was designed with this harmony in mind, that everything was pointing to and coming out of, if you like, the liturgy and the Eucharist. Now, after I converted, I started to think about art. I had an interest in art. I thought I might like to be one. And I would see churches that would commission works of art that might be like this. You'd say that it's figurative, it's not totally abstract, but in my taste it was ugly. It certainly wasn't something that I wanted to pray to. And I would ask people, others, is it just me? And pretty much everybody I asked agreed with me. The way I describe it is if I went to a dinner party and you have your sort of standard 8 people around the table, I don't know how you would organise it in the US, but in Britain you always seem to have 8 people around a table at a dinner party. And the discussion about art comes up. There would be me strongly in favour of tradition, 6 people shrugging their shoulders and saying, well, I don't really understand it, and then 1 person strongly in favour of modern art, and the 2 of us would be at each other. And then if you push the other 6 who are saying, well, I don't understand it, well, you don't need, I'd say you don't need to understand, just tell us what you feel, what you think. They all veer towards what we would call high art, traditional art. There might be some variation. But certainly if you push them on, generally people are not looking at this sort of stuff. Now, if anybody's looking at this saying, why is he saying this, you're probably not going to be with me for the rest of this lecture. Okay. I don't know what else I can say. But I began to ask the question, is this just a question of personal taste? Is there anything that's guiding artists in the past with regard to the style as well as the content that enables them to conform to something that is good and true and beautiful, and whatever that means? I'm not quite sure at this stage. And I started to investigate, and I found that there was. So here you have a crucifixion by the 17th century Spanish artist Velázquez, and this is part of the Baroque tradition cited by Pope Benedict the 16th. He says there are 3 authentic liturgical traditions: the Iconographic, the Gothic, and the Baroque, and he puts in brackets, at its best. I would say this is the Baroque at its best. So here we have Velázquez painting Christ on the cross. Now, clearly something very, very different going on here. And if you look at the art of the period, people conformed to this. It wasn't identical, but there were similarities. And so this was my starting point. What is it that links what seems to be good, what seems to be in a tradition, to something that isn't? Okay. So here we have this. This is the key aspect. It's the idea of tradition, something that is handed on, principles that are handed on, in the case of art, from one artist to the other, that define how we paint. And there are, as I mentioned, there are 3 figurative. I also include at the bottom a non-figurative, geometric patterned art. This is Christian abstract art in the sense that is non-abstract, just meaning the sense of non-figurative. Again, governed by a set of principles, and we tend to flatter ourselves that in the West that we invented abstract art with figures such as Kandinsky or Mondrian in the 20th century. There was a geometric patterned art, and where especially Mondrian was trying to do everything that had already been done centuries before and was discarded in about the time of the Enlightenment. So I just want to make you aware that it's there. Now, the form of these traditions was created by a dialogue, I discovered, between liturgists, theologians, and philosophers of the church and the artists. So when John Paul II wrote his letter to artists, he described all these past traditions. He appealed to artists to start producing work that is beautiful for this new epiphany of beauty. Remember that phrase? And he then said we need renewed dialogue between artists and the church. He didn't say, artists, go out and do it as best you can and express yourselves. He said we need renewed dialogue. In other words, this is informed by an understanding that the theology especially, our understanding of mankind, for example, as Christians, affects profoundly how we paint man. And we can't expect, no one expects an artist to know this instinctively or to know all of this. They need to be informed by those who know about this sort of thing. If I want to make art that is rooted in the liturgy, remember the liturgy is the source and summit, as the, I think, Sacrosanctum Concilium describes, of what it is to be human. It defines what our ultimate goal is in heaven. It's a supernatural step into that heavenly state of partaking of the divine nature in the heavenly liturgy. It's also the source of grace in this life that allows us to get there. And we can be divinized by degrees in this life. So the liturgical art is vital, and we need to be in dialogue with liturgists. And this is exactly what happened with these traditions. So this is a plea to artists. Don't invent your own style. Let tradition guide you. If there is an existing form that fulfills or communicates the purpose you're looking for or communicates what you want to say, then just use it. Don't innovate unless you have to. Only change things, as I say, if there is a need to communicate something that the existing forms can't, as needed by the church. And the phrase that's often used is the hermeneutic of continuity. This says that you aim to strive not to change things and only change them if you have to. And every tradition, even when working within the tradition, finds the need to reapply those principles in a way that speaks to people today. So even iconography, you can look at it with a very clearly defined tradition. And those who know about icons, I'm told, I don't know if I could quite do it, can look at a particular icon and identify it as coming from a particular geographical area and also from a particular period in time. Aidan Hart, my teacher, says to within 50 to 100 years you can look at these styles. And they're all consistent with, we're talking about now art that is consistent with the core principles of the tradition. So new styles emerge, but clearly within the form, within the principles. And that's really how we need to think, rather than trying to invent things ourselves. All right, so sometimes they talk about the icons in particular as the art of heaven, the iconographic tradition. Now, in order to understand what they're portraying, we need to consider that these are the 3 states of man as defined by John Paul II in his Theology of the Body. So original man is Adam and Eve, man, in general, man before the fall. And as far as I know, there's no artistic tradition expressly developed with that in mind. John Paul II suggests that maybe we could do with one, and if we're going to do that, we need to have that dialogue. We need to think, what does original man look like? And for example, a starting point might be to start reading the hymns to paradise of Ephraim the Syrian. This was suggested to me, who describes original man. He didn't use that phrase, but he describes Adam and Eve. So if we decide we need this, then that's where we go. Historical man is us, basically, man after the fall, with the potential for sanctity through God's grace. And the Baroque of the 17th century was developed to describe that. So there's a legitimate reason for doing so, and we'll come to this later, that there was a particular reason why they wished to do that at the time. And then third, you have what he calls eschatological man, mankind redeemed in union with God in heaven, partaking of the divine nature. So that is an art which is revealing to us our heavenly destiny. And this is the iconographic. Now I have in brackets there the Gothic after two of those. And historically, the Gothic came between in the West, as things started to change, between the iconographic, the Western iconographic forms, such as the Romanesque, and the Baroque. But in what's the form of it, in some ways, spans the divide between the two. And I always think of it as almost being the art of pilgrimage, if you like, in this life, between historical man, fallen man, and then this journey through the life of the church, if you like, or life in the church, by degrees being sanctified, by conforming. How do we do this? It's by a life focused on, centered on the liturgy of the church. This is what we're about. The sacraments point us to that. And by degrees, we can become eschatological man in this life, but not fully. We're not there fully. But we don't need to remain, shall we say, pure historical man. So here is just to remind you, here's a Gothic church, Notre Dame in Paris, and you can see that this is just covered in geometric shape and proportion, and we discussed a little bit, we touched on this on Friday, all of it imbued with significance. And even geometric patterns that you see, these conform to an idea of sacred numbers, sacred proportion, and sometimes they're numerical. It's a numerical language that we can read. Sometimes it is just linked to the fact that because we are made to intuitively see God, if you like, in his creation, see the Creator in his creation, because these participate in some way in that beauty, the idea is that we will intuitively pick that up. It will attract us and open us up to God, whether or not we understand the numerical symbolism. Right, so don't worry, we are going to see some pictures soon. In Christian figurative traditions, the form, this is an important point, the form is always a balance between naturalism and idealism. So if I'm going to paint a man, it must look like a man. I can't try and do what the abstract expressionists tried to do, which is to paint emotion separated from man. They're abstracting expression from man. In other words, they're removing the soul from the body. That contravenes the idea of the human person, where we know what someone is thinking and feeling through the body. The two are profoundly united. And so if I want to paint a man, it must look like a man. But at the same time, I want to reveal invisible truths through the form. So to some degree, I have to idealize or partially abstract, if you like, change things, so that through the style of it, The observers, who are all going to be historical man, all fallen man to some degree or another, can understand, can pick up what the truths are. And it's this partial abstraction that leads to the distinctive styles, because it's how you change things from natural appearances that leads to us to be able to identify and distinguish between one tradition or another. And this is true also for secular modern art. You could say that in conformity to truth there's an imbalance, but they understand full well that you must change appearances, you must abstract in order to reveal what you want to say. And they do it all the time. And the art schools push, the mainstream art schools push the secular ideologies and very clearly link what they do to it. And if based upon the assumption, and it's a wrong assumption that it's true, I think that they're quite rational and logical in the art that they produce. So they understand this as well. Okay, so that's just a summary of what I said. Okay, so let's look at these three traditions. Now, I'm not going to talk at length about icons and how the form is governed by the theology, because this is one area in which there is a lot of information available, and I wouldn't be surprised if you haven't had a talk already, you already will, or you will soon, because there are plenty of people who talk about this. But first of all, can I take it that most people here, when I talk about icons, even if they can't define exactly what it is, they would see that and recognize that as an icon, and they know roughly what I'm talking about? I thought that would be the case. So here we have an icon of the Transfiguration. There's a great book by someone called, I think it's called Jean Courbon, called The Wellspring of Worship, in which he talks about the Transfiguration icon. And he says that this is very important because it reveals to us how, as really what our mission in life is. That as Christians, we participate, we are part of the mystical body of Christ. And this Transfiguration is an anticipation of Christ in heaven, the sight of Christ in heaven. But also, because the church is the mystical body of Christ, our participation in the liturgy of the church allows us by degrees to participate in that transfiguration. We are transformed, transfigured as well. And what he says is that that is the means by which we will evangelize. When we go out into the world, it is the fact that we shine with the light of Christ that will attract people to what we do. So as well as all the information and all about the culture, it's the way we do things as much as anything else that will pull people in everyday life, just as we heard just now. That it's the ordinary things that we do. And at root, this is about personal transformation through the liturgy. And he says this icon is telling us this. So very important, I think, for us to focus on our end point, our destination, if we're going to be able to do that. So just to give you some quick examples, so I'm not going to go into detail, the fact that, for example, this is revealing mankind in the heavenly dimension means that everyone is shining with the uncreated light. The assumption is that as Christ was transfigured, so will we be in union with God. Therefore, if I'm shining with light, there will be no cast shadow, so you don't get cast shadows. You'll notice that when you see faces, we'll see one in a second also, but unlike a naturalistic portrait where you have a glint on the eye, it's very important if anyone's a portrait painter, you've got to get that right, because it indicates even how healthy somebody is, how shiny, how large you make that little white dot, because it gives an indication of the moistness of the eyes, all this sort of thing. That icons don't show that, because that is reflected light, the glint, and the icon is a source of light, the person in an icon, and so it's consistent with that idea. Even the halo is a symbol of sanctity, of holiness, but is really a stylized, pictorial representation of, again, the light, light of the uncreated light of divinity shining out of the saints. And then the other thing is the flatness of it. The whole design is done deliberately to try and eliminate a sense of depth and space, because the heavenly realm is outside time and space. It's another sort of existence. It's as though all places are simultaneously in one place, and all time, past, future, simultaneously compressed into a single moment. So I'm told. I'm not an expert, and I don't know if I can imagine it, but what that would be like. But it's a very different sort of being, existence. So here you have, I did this one. This is Our Lady and Our Lord, of course. And you see no glint on the eyes. Also, with the eyes of purity, when in the heavenly state, not only do we, shall we say, appear different, we're shining with this light, but our ability to see and perceive and apprehend the truth of what is around us is different because of our purity. And so I was always told that the eyes of saints in icons are always enlarged because they take in information. They always act with economy of effort and great effectiveness, but they always think and act wisely before they act, so that those organs that take in information are slightly enlarged. Those that act are always reduced slightly, the mouth especially. I think I'll just leave it at that. I don't want to go into too much detail. There are lots of books on icons. This is St. Luke. And you even have reverse perspective, inverse perspective. So things getting wider as they go further away from you, or sometimes parallel, which is contrary to the idea of single point perspective. And what this does is just, again, destroy this illusion of space. It's a deliberate thing that is done. But we still have to be able to read it and see what it is. If it's so distorted that we can't tell that St. Luke is sitting on a chair and there's this is in front of him with the script from which he's writing, then it doesn't work. We need to be able to create a sense of local depth so that we know that this leg is in front of this one. So there's this dynamic between the stylization and the invisible truths you're trying to communicate and the natural appearances, which we need in order to discern what is there as the observers here on earth, so to speak. Okay. Now, this is a Russian icon from, I think, the early 19th century. And in Russia, certainly, although there was no Renaissance to speak of, it was affected by the Enlightenment, and it affected art there too. So you start to get the iconographic tradition. The phrase that my teacher used, you get degenerate forms. So what you have here is it's done in oil, which is too three-dimensional, too sensuous. The media that are used in icons are deliberately chosen because they look flat on the surface. Everything seems to live, so to speak, on the surface, the plane of the painting, rather than creating an illusion of depth. This is done in oil, which does the opposite. There is a landscape there, there's a sense of perspective, and also even a sky in a landscape. And so what you have historically is, in the West, all art up to about 1200, even all the styles that you think of, Carolingian, those who are art history people will recognize phrases such as Artonian art, Carolingian art, Celtic art that we know, up to the Romanesque. So something like 1130, 12, there's no clear division. all of this conformed to the iconographic prototype. These were local variations that in the figurative art were consistent with the iconographic prototype, that art which is trying to reveal eschatological man to us, or to show us, shall we say, our heavenly destiny, our heavenly goal. In the West, it changed to the Gothic, and then by the 17th century you had the Baroque, and then in the West we were affected by the Enlightenment, and things started to go bad around the 19th century artistically. You start to see deviation from what you might call Christian forms. In the East, this was affected around the same period by the Enlightenment. What's happened is that around the I don't know if anybody here has been to an icon painting class, but classes today are as a result of work that was done particularly by expatriate Russians living in Paris in the middle of the 20th century, who sat down and looked at what they felt were authentic icons and did an analysis of them. They looked at the form, so they just decided what they felt were the authentic tradition, and they worked out a theology that seemed consistent with the form that they saw. And all the things that you hear, some may have come down by word of mouth from, I'm sure the line wasn't broken, but for example, a lot of the things that I heard in icon painting classes, they're not written by church fathers. They come out actually out of this analysis that was done in the middle of the 20th century. Now, I think it was a very, very good analysis, because as a result of what they've done, they've re-established this as a living tradition. There are generations now of icon painters who come out of them and who are producing work that is consistent with this tradition, and they have a strong sense of where they can move within those bounds, and you're getting also individual expressions, but in the right sort of way, emerging. So it's a very, very healthy situation. What we need to do in the West is start doing the same sort of analysis, and what you're going to hear from me are the first attempts, if you like, to do the same for the Gothic and the Baroque. Now, it's interesting to note that this analysis that was done by Orthodox Russians who were prejudiced to some degree against Western art forms. And so it seemed, the way that I would characterize it, what I heard was very, very good when they talk about icons, but when contrasted with Western traditions, it's not always worth listening. Their analysis of other art was not always worth listening to. It's deliberately presented so as to mitigate against Western art. Some of it needs to be discarded, I would say, but not those authentic traditions of the Gothic and the Baroque. So you need to be aware of that when you read. Most of the books you get on icons now are representing that analysis. What unites art worthy of veneration that sit within these traditions are two things by tradition. One is that the saint or the person as the image bears the characteristics of the person portrayed. Now this means some sort of likeness, but as much the things that you use to identify that person, even if we don't have a portrait-like likeness. And the other thing is the presence of the name on the icon. These are the things that make it worthy of veneration. And in authentic liturgical art, you'll see both of these things manifested in different ways. I'm just going to tell you one story, actually, about just to illustrate this. First of all, initially there were lots of rules about icons that came. When I met Aidan Hart, my teacher, who is Eastern Orthodox, something like 20 years ago, and I went to him. I wanted to learn how to do icon painting. I went to him with a textbook that I'd found, which was a reprint and a translation of something written by an Italian called Cennino Cennini in, I think, the 15th century, or maybe the 14th century. And it showed a particular method of painting where you do a line drawing, you do a monochrome underpainting, in other words, a black and white version, if you like, and then you do layers of paint over it. And I showed this to my teacher, and he said, no, 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 this contravenes the theology of icons, because you have to start with a dark base and the light comes out of it. You can't put the black on initially. There's a theology in the methodology, in the method itself. Now, I must admit, I was puzzled by this. I thought, well, if you can't tell with the end product, isn't an image what you see at the end? I mean, does it matter what went into it in the first place? But I accepted what he said. And this is what and then I'd hear this repeated in lots of icon classes. And then, something like 5 or 6 years ago, a book came out, published in Russia, and was then translated into English, where they'd done X-ray analysis on centuries of icons. And what they discovered was that the older method was the method that was actually had been retained in the West and was described by Cennino Cennini. The new method was the one that I'd been described as corresponding to the theology of the dark layer and then gradually putting the light highlights on. And I know that this, I knew about this because I have to say fair play to Aidan. He phoned me up and said, I've just read this, and I have to take back what I said. He said, in the end, I realized that the image at the end is the important thing. And steadily, and he said, from now on, I'm going to use the Cennino Cennini method because I can produce them more quickly and better. And he said, and gradually over the years, he said that, for example, colour symbolism. He said, as soon as you try and set down some rules for colour symbolism, you'll find something that contradicts it. And so he says, generally, it's not that colour is unimportant, but they're developed to speak to the local culture, if you like. There's more local variation, but there are no hard and fast rules. And so it's probably a little broader than most of us imagine. But that's not to say that there aren't clear principles. Okay, so what happened in the West? After about 1100 or something, there's a steadily increasing appreciation of the value of the natural world and our ability to perceive it with our senses. And this is due in part to the combined effect of the incorporation of the philosophy of Aristotle into Christian thinking, with figures such as Bonaventure and Thomas Aquinas, Albert the Great. You may have heard of these names. Incorporating this into Christian thinking, and the influence of the spirituality of Francis of Assisi. So what happened is that through contact with, for example, I think the libraries of the Islamic lands that were being reconquered in Toledo in Spain, for example, also contact with the East through the Crusades, I think, there was a rediscovery of the works of the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, and gradually it was translated, and then in the light of the Gospels was assessed for truth by these figures. And the great change was this, it's not a total transformation, just an increased emphasis on the value of information, of the information gained through the senses of the world around us. And our ability, although we're fallen, we can still perceive something that is useful and good about the information around us. And that the world itself, the estimation of the value of the world around us now changed in part. Again, it's a subtle shift of emphasis, not night and day or a sudden change. So there may be suffering, there may be evil, but it is still good nevertheless, and points in some way to what it ought to be. And so there's just a focus on that, relatively, as a result of this in the West. Now, this affected art and gave rise to an interest in the world around us, and also to the beginning of scientific, the development of the scientific method and scientific investigation. Now, I mentioned those figures such as Aquinas and Bonaventure. They did, if you like, the academic work, the intellectual work, but that doesn't allow it subsequently to permeate necessarily through into the way that people thought naturally. And so much of that was done by the influence of the spirituality of St. Francis of Assisi, who just loved nature. But the great thing about him is he had it in its right place. He was an ascetic who understood that it couldn't be placed too high. There's a value to the body, but it's not the ultimate thing that we appreciate. And so that popularized, if you like, these ideas. And you may be aware that a lot of the early artists in the Gothic period, and also scientists in Oxford, for example, were Franciscan friars or Third Order Franciscans. Okay, so that's just really a repeat what I've said. Now, Gothic art, therefore, I'm talking about figurative art, is a greater naturalism, but it's grafted onto a Byzantine substrate. What do I mean? If you want to paint in a particular style, if you want to paint at all, traditionally there are two aspects to the training. One is the observation of nature. So if I want to paint superheroes in the style of Superman and Batman and Spider-Man, one thing I do is go and do some life drawing to get a sense of what the human form looks like, the thing that I'm actually drawing. The other thing I do is learn or copy and study the works of masters in that tradition. So I buy a huge pile of Marvel comics and I just copy Spider-Man endlessly, and then pretty soon what will happen is every figure that I draw will naturally be in the style of these bulging muscular figures at strange angles, rotated at any way. That is how you do it. And that's true in any tradition. If I want to work in the iconographic tradition, there's not so much emphasis on life drawing, but certainly we have to observe people around us. When we talked about drawing the face, for example, we referred the features on the painting that we were studying to what we were invited to feel. For example, the fact that the nose comes down, there's bone, and then cartilage here, and it pinches in. So it broadens, it thins, and then it widens again at the end. And this is what you see in the face of the icon, and it's reflecting what exists in us in nature, the anatomy. So it's always a balance between the two. The Gothic artists, their old masters, if you like, were the iconographic art of the Romanesque that had existed there before. And all that happened is you get an increased emphasis on the natural appearances. They started to study nature. And so gradually you get a fusing of one with the other. Initially, there were subtle changes. So one thing that this is a late Gothic. This is Fra Angelico, 15th century, Florentine, Dominican. But in many ways, these figures are similar to the iconographic. They're painted in the middle distance. There's this sense of distance between us and them, which draws us in. The sharp lines and detail painted there. So as we approach it, it reveals more and more detail. But there are other things that are different. That figure is in profile. In an icon, you would never get a figure in profile. Always they're either three-quarter or full. You can see both eyes. The reason for that, the devil would be in profile, incidentally, but for a saint, is that the saint wishes to reveal his whole person to you. It signifies also that when we look at someone, if I can speak it in that way as though it's just a time and a place, but when we look at someone, our intellect can grasp fully who they are, or look at an object, what it is. Everything is present to us. That's also a reason why, incidentally, you paint the backs of things tipped up. It's as though I can look at that and I know what's there as well. That's a way of symbolizing that. Now, in this only partially divinized state, if you like, on this pilgrimage to heaven, climbing up the Gothic spire with its feet firmly planted on the ground, pointing upwards, what we have is some elements of the natural and some elements of the heavenly. We do have cast shadow here. Of course, we have the historical detail of St. Dominic there, who was present at the Annunciation, in case anyone was aware of that. And we have a perspective and cast shadows, but we also have, if this is the source of light from the left here, we'd expect that face to be in shadow, wouldn't we? But it isn't. Okay? St. Dominic's is, but not the angel. Okay? Now, somebody once asked me, this is an interesting little aside, somebody once asked me, well, if that's the case, and the angel is shining with light, and what Fra Angelico is doing here, he's manipulating, he's using elements of the iconographic, elements of the naturalistic, to show these two worlds at once, in a way. Someone said, well, how come you have a shadow behind Mary? And I have to say, I was rather, I don't know. I mean, it might be an accident, maybe didn't think about it, but that's probably not for Fra Angelico. So I gave some explanation that, well, you have two light sources here. You have the angel, well, even three of St. Dominic as a source of light, pushing light in this direction. Mary is just one light source. She can't compete, so you get a bit of a cast shadow. I don't think even I was convinced by that as I said it. But it's all I could think of. I wasn't sure. And the person who asked me said, well, do you think that Fra Angelico was making a point? Because it was before, remember, that the Immaculate Conception was dogmatically defined. Fra Angelico was a Dominican. The Dominicans argued against it. And it was the Franciscans who were asserting that. Of course, the Dominicans, I don't know if you ever had talks by Dominicans, they always take digs at the Franciscans or the Benedictines. And those three, they're always taking little jokey potshots. That rivalry goes back. And he said, do you think that maybe Fra Angelico is making a point about the Immaculate Conception and arguing against it by putting that shadow there? I don't know. So even this is Jan van Eyck. It's the Flemish artist from the 15th century. And Adam and Eve are fallen, and they're in deep shadow. Here you have the Eucharist represented here, the Supper of the Lamb, shining with light, no cast shadow, or very little, except, of course, from the ultimate light. Here, rising in the east, everything is orientated towards the Orient, the east, everyone facing in that direction. And even though this is highly naturalistic, there is still that sense of distance. Everything's in the middle distance. At root, there's a strong sense of that something iconographic there. It's derived from us. You get a sense of just a greater naturalism fused onto this Byzantine substrate. And so this is more naturalistic again than Fra Angelico, but we can see that it's still linked to it in some way. Now, something suddenly happened in the West to cause a huge change in style. So up to this point, what you had is a change, but by the artists aware of what they're doing, thinking about the tradition that this is coming out of, playing around with light and shade and perspective, as though they're somewhere on this pilgrimage from here to heaven, if you like, by degrees, following that liturgical path to heaven. Suddenly, you get a whole change in style. And what caused this is not, and I'm talking now about the High Renaissance, is not increased naturalism. That had already been going on for 300 years or something like that, the observation of nature. What changed were the old masters that they copied. That is the major influence on style, is the works of old masters that you copy. Instead of looking at Gothic masters or Romanesque, contact with, again, there was a focus on classical texts, And really, all I can say is they just thought they were so beautiful, they just said, right, we're going to copy that. I can find no theological imperative for this dislocation in style. In other words, there's no reason why they had to do it, I don't think. You might argue that when they discovered these Greek and Roman statues, they saw something that was so naturalistic that they thought, this is consistent with what we're trying to do, it's better than we're able to do, let's use that. Okay? That's legitimate. What I'd say is that I'm not aware of any theological bar either. I don't think you could look at those statues and say there's something that is bad for us to copy there. Although my personal view is I wish that it had never happened. But anyway, there you go. So here you have a statue from 500 BC. Things to notice. I'm just going to pick out just the facial features. It's a sort of composite face that represented the perfection of beauty for the ancient Greeks. And you see it it's as though all the gods have that face. And then also that pose, which is a way they developed with the heel rising. It allows the weight of the statue to be transmitted downwards, and on this foot here, and it gives a sense of motion, but without making the statue unstable. You can imagine if you paint somebody sort of in full flight running on one toe, even if you get it perfect, it's unstable, it's going to fall, and then that's how we move, is gravity pulls us forward to a large degree. And the same would happen to the statue. So this is the way that they worked out a pose that is stable, will stand up, but gives a sense of motion. It's just about to step off. This is a statue by Michelangelo, done 2,000 years later. And you see the facial features. They're deliberately looking at that. This is very different from a Gothic style, and he has the same pose. And they deliberately set out to copy, and all the drawings that became part of the standard technique of learning to draw was copying plaster casts of these statues relentlessly. This is a painting by Raphael around the same period, around 1500. It's in the National in Washington, D.C., actually. And this is Our Lady with John the Baptist and our Lord. And even the face here is based upon that Greek ideal. And there are accounts of Raphael saying that he said, there is no woman who is beautiful enough for me. I have to take features from this one and features from this one, and together I produce something that is worthy of my art. And what he's doing, he's describing exactly the tradition as to how the Greek artists produced this ideal image. They talked about their accounts of how they used to do this. In order to get an idea of what that might be like, he had to work from the statues. I don't know if there's any Greek painting extant. If there is, there's very, very little. So we have accounts of how naturalistic it was, how good it was. But they're using those statues as a basis for it. Okay, and we can see a very, very different look, strong, accompanied with a very, very strong sense of space. We have a landscape, very naturalistic. They now switch to oil in order to portray this. And you have other figures such as Leonardo doing the same sort of thing. And then Titian, who started off in the early 16th century, he had a long, long life. And he steadily developed this. Okay, now these figures were great innovators, but there was no real theology worked out to link this to any other aspect of man other than what you might call naturalistic. Individual artists would think about it. Michelangelo was a deep thinker, but it's not as if his ideas just pervaded everybody. You had individuals working out what to do, trying to think about it. And so at this stage, they're pioneers of a tradition. And this is why the High Renaissance is not listed by Pope Benedict as one of the authentic liturgical traditions. the Baroque of the 17th century is. So this was the art of the Catholic Counter-Reformation, and under the direction of figures such as Charles Borromeo, who really thought about how all these elements that were being developed in the High Renaissance came together. They brought together these innovations into a single form, which became the Baroque. So this was right at the end of the 16th century, the late 1500s, and the first person who did this, following these ideas, was Caravaggio. I put it in brackets here because it's as though he ushered in the Baroque. Now, I haven't got a picture by him, but you know, I'm assuming you know the art of Caravaggio, this deep, for example, he is the one who invented this visual language of light and dark, where the shadow represents evil and suffering, the light is contrasted with it, and the light overcomes the darkness and offers hope. And just as all hope transcends and overcomes suffering in the Christian message. Okay. Now, the aim of Baroque art is to instruct and inspire the faithful to love God and mankind. Sometimes it's suggested with Western art, this is all it does is instruct. It's just didactic. Not so in all of these traditions. Certainly, though, it is part of it. And then with the Baroque, the aim is to reveal God's presence here on earth in a sinful world, to encourage us, to give us hope. To give us a sense that God is here with us and therefore can raise us up to heaven. And in one sense it is, so we're going to analyse one now, it is complementary to the iconographic. The iconographic shows where we're going to. The Baroque, in the way that we're going to describe in a second, shows us where we are. And the Gothic encourages us to believe that we can set off on that journey here and now. So here we have a painting by Velázquez, the one we saw earlier. If anyone's ever seen this, it's in the Prado. It just looks, it jumps out at you. It looks as though every detail is there. And then what happens is that you go up to it and it just disappears into a mass of brushstrokes. It's amazing how broad brush it is. Now, I don't know if any of you ever had that experience with an old master in an art gallery, where you see it, you think, this is incredible, I want to get closer. It just goes out of focus somehow, and so it forces you back, and then it pops into focus again. Okay? This is the loincloth. It's amazing how rough the whole thing is. Now, what's going on here? The method that is used here to draw this is very deliberate. So you have to imagine now me doing a cast drawing in the academy in Florence where I studied, which used the same method as Velázquez. I put the cast here, I put my easel here, and I march back to a point on the floor here. And I look at the two, and I start off with a piece of string, measure the height of the top of the head, look at my piece of paper, fix my eyes on it, walk forward, and mark. Then I come back, and I check whether it's right. Usually it isn't. It can be an inch off or something. So I then say, okay, I've got to move down a little bit. So I move forward. And gradually, I build up the whole picture, drawing from memory here what I saw there. Okay. This means that the whole thing is in focus here. Don't go forward and sort of look at this, and that ruins it. I have to draw from a short-term memory. So what happens is that in contrast to the iconographic, which draws you in, it's in the middle distance the whole time, so you just want to get closer, and it's always in the middle distance because the angle of vision doesn't change. And it reveals more detail, almost to the point of, then at a certain point you can't get any closer, and it takes your attention up to heaven, the saint in heaven. I go beyond the image In that way, it's a doorway to heaven, creates this link through the imagination, directed by the image, to the real person in heaven. What this does, if I try and get closer, it says, you stay where you are, I'm coming out to you. It's the opposite dynamic. I am with you now. It's designed to have an impact at a distance. And when I described this to somebody at the Maryvale Institute, she said, well, this is just like Jacob's ladder. You have two ladders. One, the angels are coming down, the other angels are going up. And they're complementary to each other. Okay. This is the Penitent Magdalene by a great French artist from the same period, Georges de la Tour. And I just want to talk about one other thing here. I'm going to go over time a bit, I realize. But notice, first of all, how little colour there is. The naturalistic colour is just in this area. And also how so much of it is out of focus. It's blurred. You can't see a clean edge between there and there. That edge is blurred. Okay? Now, I could spend lecture after lecture going into this in detail. This is done deliberately by the artist. It's controlled by the artist. The assumption right at the root of this, remember this idea that the cosmos, I talked about this on Friday, is made for us. It's made for man, so that man can observe it, and through looking at it, see the mark of the Creator. It raises our souls to God. And so they started to think, just as I described on Friday, how do we perceive that beauty? How do we look? If I look at a scene, just think about the way you've been looking at me, for example. Everybody has an angle of focus, which is about 15 degrees. So that means that you can't see the whole of me very easily. You tend to, especially those who are close to, you tend to spend most of your time looking here. Okay? Now, just to make sure that I'm not a floating head, occasionally you do cursory glances up and down. If I do that, suddenly that'll catch your eye and you see my hand. Okay? At any point, though, what is on the retina of your eye is an image which in the center is coloured and sharp and in focus to about 15 degrees. And that's the area where the cones, I think it is, particular sorts of cells are. All the information around that is monochrome. It's just tonal information. And it is blurred. That's not what we see in our mind's eye. What happens is that information is fed to the brain. The brain says, well, actually, although that's the image I'm getting, I know what the rest of you are, what goes here, what's the missing information, because I looked at the rest of you earlier on. I have in my memory things that when I saw you before. And so the picture we see is a natural image. And what tends to happen if we look at any scene is we focus on certain areas which are of primary interest, usually conforming to the hierarchy of being, and there might be two or three, and all the rest of the information, the rest of the time when we're not looking at that, the memory is supplying information, what we see in our mind's eye. Okay? Illusionists make use of that by tricking the mind into supplying information which isn't there. Because if we haven't seen something, the brain says, well, I don't know what's there, but I know what something like this normally looks like. I've seen a head before, and usually it has a neck and shoulders and arms, so I'm going to supply one. And that's what we see. And then illusionists will trick you like this. Now, these are not illusionists. They're trying to reveal truth, but they make us respond in the same way. They draw our attention to the primary point of interest, where the contrast is greatest, where the light is greatest. They give us most information. And they keep us away from these areas and let the brain supply that information. And the reasoning behind this is they want us to respond to this in the same way we respond to the natural world, so that our thoughts go beyond it to the Creator. In other words, it's participating by inducing that reaction in us in the beauty of the cosmos, and the idea being that it causes that same reaction in us. Okay. Now, as you can imagine, I could talk at length about all of these, and then also the mundane art which comes out of these, particularly the Baroque. You get landscapes, portraits, that all owe their style to that sacred art, and that just dominated the West because of its power and its beauty. Now, here we have a statement in Mediata Dei by Pius XII. And just like the Church's statements on music, if they direct towards certain styles, they never close the door altogether to innovation and things new. Recent works of art which lend themselves to the materials of modern composition should not be universally despised. And despite everything I said, I would agree with that, and rejected through prejudice. Modern art should be given free scope in the due and reverent service of the Church and the sacred rites, provided, that's my underlining, that they preserve the correct balance between styles tending neither to extreme realism or excessive symbolism, and that the needs of the Christian community are taken into consideration rather than the particular taste or talent of the individual artist. I mean, he has said in a paragraph, well, I spent an hour and whatever, over an hour now, sorry, actually communicating. It's a balance between naturalism and abstraction. It's the need that defines whether you do anything new or not. But nevertheless, we should not reject things out of hand simply because they're new. What this does say to me is that we should not adapt the form of secular culture, which is derived from an anti-Catholic worldview, into sacred art, which is that very first slide. That's what that was doing. That was early 20th century expressionism, which came out of a secular worldview, post-Enlightenment worldview, and those forms do not correspond to what Pius XII, did I say the 10th? Only Pius XII said. So we must be discerning. We don't want to be prejudiced, but we do want to make judgments that are good once we've looked at the styles. And if we get this wrong, there's an electionary that was recently produced in Italy, sadly. Okay. We always need to look to tradition, and with that I will close. So thank you very much.
Can you explain what Pope Benedict XVI meant by the word verticality and its importance on Catholic art, architecture, and the liturgy?
No, precisely. I hear this used a lot, the vertical and the horizontal. I think what is meant by the horizontal is this emphasis on community of people, and an overemphasis on the horizontal in liturgy is at the expense of the heavenly, if you like, going beyond this world. So when people say that both should be there, I mean, the emphasis needs to be on taking our minds up to God. And there's a strong sense, I think, that recently that has not been going on, and that everybody's just emphasizing the horizontal, which is a community of people. Maybe there's something more sophisticated than that, but I don't know if there is. So that's the best answer I can give.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I had a question. Earlier on in the presentation, you discussed how art is objectively true or beautiful. And it's not necessarily a subjective thing that people just say, oh, I like this, I like that. But you can actually say that some art is, objectively speaking, superior and more beautiful to other art. And the Pope had highlighted Baroque and Gothic as primary examples of that, as demonstrations of true beauty. How do you go about explaining to people how some art is, objectively speaking, more true and communicates more truth and beauty than others?
Well, the fact that that is so, that we can say that something is objectively beautiful, doesn't mean that it's easy for us to discern that. So it doesn't mean there is no room for difference of opinion. There may be differences of opinion, but that depends on our ability to perceive it. So I might look at something, you might look at something, and even asking those questions. I mean, the first point I want to make is that regardless of how we answer, let's at least ask those questions. In my opinion, is it true? In my opinion, is it beautiful? But all I'm saying is that there are traditions that exist within the church that give us some guidelines, and we rely, if you like, on consensus for those. So, and then where's the Pope getting that from? I think probably he's giving us his personal opinion, and we have to say, do we trust his judgment? So, and my judgment, should we say my taste coincides with his, so I say yes, we do. But you can never escape. It's not a rigid set of guidelines in which you can you can look at something, tick boxes, and say, that is beautiful, that is true, that is good. We know that something that is good has all those things. But in the end, the strongest guideline you have is actually consensus over an extended period. And that's what a tradition is. Beyond that, and if I was choosing something for a church, I would be very conservative because I don't want to take chances. In my home, I might pick something that, okay, it was painted by somebody in the 20th century, doesn't correspond precisely, but in my opinion, it seems to nourish my prayer. I might perhaps choose it. So in different situations, personal taste has a greater influence. But that's really the value of tradition. You try and ascertain what people have done over an extended period, and that gives you the greatest guideline you can.
Just touching on the point that you made at the very end about that you choose the form that is that fits our tradition rather than one from a secular worldview that's anti-Catholic, for example. I just wonder what you think about the possibility of redeeming a form that began as a secular form and drawing it into Catholic culture.
It's possible, but you have to do it discerningly. The problem with most of the attempts to do what you're describing is the only criterion that people use in choosing secular forms is it popular? And the assumption is that if it's popular there and I add Christian content to it, it'll be popular here, and therefore it'll pull people into the church. That's not sufficient, is what I would say. The church has always looked at external forms and drawn them in and redeemed them. After all, that's exactly what happened with all her first art. It was really taken from the classical forms. So you can do that discerningly, even with secular modern art. But it has to be done in an understanding. In order to do that, we have to know our own traditions thoroughly, I would suggest.
I would like to mention or put a plug in for the Faith and Life series, Teaching CCD. It has the books for Teaching CCD have beautiful art, and they're like, Titian or Fra Angelico or whoever. However, there are many publications that have modern art for children. For instance, The Way of the Cross that we have in our parish, and some other things that our former text was just pictures that the children themselves could draw.
Okay.
So
can I just stop you there? Can you just say what your question is at the end of this?
Yeah, the question is there any hope for promoting this type of like Faith and Life series, or promoting better art for children?
Well, there's always hope. I mean, this is why we have these. The hope is that maybe somebody here runs a publishing company and will choose things and show an interest. But it is important what we show to young people, I think, yeah.
In your first lecture, you showed us ratios with notes, music. Can that be done with a spectrogram regarding color?
Perhaps. I don't know. I don't see why not. The thing about colours is I think artists intuitively use colour thinking about the psychological impact it has. So that's putting colour symbolism aside. So people, the language is a warm colour, cool colours, this sort of thing. But I don't see why it shouldn't. The thing I would say, though, is that in figurative art, for example, it has to be simple. You can't use complex proportions and then try and fit a figurative piece to it. It looks forced, it looks sterile. What I was told to do in using proportions is I just have Aidan would tell me to divide things up into thirds and quarters, and then you have a grid, and then also the external dimensions. You can think about that and put them in proportion. And he said, do your best to place compositional highlights on those points. And he said, because the eye, they're like resonant points. The eye naturally comes to rest within them, within the dimensions of it. But at the end of it, you do your best. You normally can't do it perfectly, otherwise you'd end up with an elbow here and a hand there, and it just doesn't look. So at the end of it, all these are guidelines to help you to move towards an ideal. But you have to look at it and say, does it look right? Does it look... And so in the end, you're always adjusting things relative to each other so that it just looks harmonious. There's always that final intuitive element that moves things around. So that this is why I'm always suspicious of very precise measurements used on single paintings that say, oh, the artist used this, when I know as an artist that they're not that precise in the way they do them. So, yeah. To come back to answer the colour, I don't know, but quite possibly is the answer. Yeah.
We have an email question coming in from Front Royal, Virginia. This is my wife. Now, she did put a comma in her question, which is breaks my rule, but I will allow it this one time. And as I read the question, you'll know why I married her. Is there a need for a repromulgation of a universal language of imagery? Or can modern artists still communicate effectively through sacred art to a modern man who does not necessarily understand a more classical artistic language? Okay.
I think this is something that's worth thinking about. The symbolism, if you like, is supposed to elucidate, clarify, communicate. So those things which are... The answer is, I think, yes. But I would start with those things which are rooted in an intuitive appreciation. The halo, for example, speaks just in the image of truth. Then I think it's probably not. So one of those might be, for example, and this always caused difficulties with traditionalists, the pelican, which is a symbol of the Eucharist because it was believed to correspond to a scientific truth that I think it fed its young from its breast or something like that, or its own blood. Now, that isn't true. And we don't want to, they thought that it clarified something based upon what was commonly believed to be true. We don't think that anymore. So I'd say, as long as if that symbol isn't widely known, we shouldn't be trying to re-establish it because it just makes us a laughingstock, actually. Which is what Augustine said. He said, we don't go against what people commonly believe to be true because they'll never believe anything we say, or in that nature. So,
I want to thank you all for coming out this evening, but also for this entire series. A number of you asked the question, what about our program on music? Will Professor George Hahn be able to come and present that program? He is coming to the Washington, D.C. area in February, God willing, and has agreed to come and speak at the Institute, so we'll be able to complete our whole series then. But I will offer just one concluding remark. As we've looked at these programs over the last few weeks, our speakers have continually pointed to an objective reality which is found in nature itself, which itself is a revelation, a fingerprint, if you will, of God's creative act. And there, from that point, we can begin to understand what it is that is beautiful on this earth and what it is that pleases man as long as he's living the right life. And as we consider that, I think we can go ahead and leave our series, and I encourage you to go out and take your walks and look at your gardens in something of a new way, to be able to has placed in creation as a model for what is truly beautiful among men. And from there, we can begin to walk and appreciate the things of God and to be able to live as He designed us to live.